Welcome, and thanks for stopping by. Whether you're new to the channel or have been here before, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Today we're going to take another look at the Zelos Horizon. If you're unfamiliar with this model, we previously featured a full unboxing as well as review of the Horizon V2 on this channel, and I'll have a video linked to that in the description. Today we wanted to look at something a little bit differently. Specifically, since we have featured the Horizon V2, and I previously did not have my Horizon V1 available, I wanted to take another look and do a little bit of a deeper dive between these two models, or these two versions of this model, and see how they compare. Is it really just iterative changes, or are they completely different animals? And as we'll see in the video here, the changes are actually more substantial than I had initially realized, and then were announced by Zelos. So let's go through and kind of give a blow-by-blow of some of the more obvious things, as well as some of the subtle changes that were experienced between these two versions. So the main thing that jumps out at everyone right off the bat, and this was one of the biggest features of changes in terms of the announcement, is the overall crystal change. So on the right here, we have the Horizons V1, and on the left we have the Horizons V2. The specific colorways, this is the limited Timekeepers edition. This was an exclusive to the Facebook group, and this is an Aventurine dial. It is really a stunning dial. You can see a little bit of that twinkling star type effect. And then this one is the Frost colorway here on the left. I don't want to focus too much on that because both of these are available in many different colorways. That is one of the changes for the V2, is it is all new colorways between them. Carries some similarities to the first version, but overall it is completely new. So if you look at the crystal here, from this angle, you can get a good idea as to what's going on with these. So the V1 Horizons featured a dome crystal, and you can see a very slight box edge on it. In the dome, it's a pretty subtle, not flat by any means, but it is a very subtle dome. On the Horizon V2, this is the most obvious of the changes when you first pick one up. You can see it's a very tall box dome. The dome itself is still relatively flat, actually possibly even a little more flat, but the box edge here is very pronounced. That has significant implications, and I've seen a lot of reviewers commenting on the visibility. If we look here and try to see the chapter ring, on this you can see the chapter ring is very visible just from a straight-on angle. With the V2, you do have to tilt that, and we're getting a little bit of glare there, to see the chapter ring. I personally don't think it's a bad thing, and I very much like the distortion effect. You can see as I rotate this around that you get on the edge. I think it's a neat look, and it makes it something unique in both my collection and for the watch as a whole. But that is the most obvious of the adjustments. The next piece, we just were speaking a moment ago about the rehaut here, or the chapter ring. This piece, as you can see going around, is a significantly more sloped, and it cuts more into the dial, whereas this one is more vertical. And along those same lines, you'll notice this has cutouts for the index, whereas this one, because it's pushed farther back, the indexes are set off of that, so there's no cutout. It's just a straight rehaut all the way around, whereas this one has grooves as it goes around. While we're on the topic of indexes, this is one that didn't initially jump out at me, and I'm not sure how well the camera will pick it up. The index on the V1, or indexes on the V1, were a wider and more flat index, whereas these markers, I think you can pick up, these are more three-dimensional, so they have more of a sharp edge. They come up higher off of the dial, but they have a little bit thinner in terms of the lume presence between them. So that's one of the more subtle adjustments between the two. The dial text, and this is just getting into minor items, the dial text on the V2, particularly on the depth, but it's true for both, or I should say it's more noticeable on the depth. The dial text is a little bit larger on the V2 versus the V1. Along those same lines, if we look at the GMT hand here, You can see on the V2, it is a fully pointed triangle. On the V1, the triangle tip is cut off there. And again, I'm not addressing the color differences because that does vary from model to model. Similarly, we'll notice on the dial, this Horizon's Aventurine here, the V1, does not have a date window. That is something that is exclusive or specific to this model, and that's because of the fragility of the Aventurine material. It couldn't make those cuts for the date window, so that is not a difference between the V1 versus the V2. Both of those are available with a date window. The next thing, and this is one of the other very big in announced changes, is the V1 had a 60-click bezel, whereas the V2 has a 48-click bezel. They're both still ball bearing, they're both still sapphire crystal inlay, but as far as the actual bezel action, this one has less notches, but it's more practical from a standpoint of a GMT in that this can do half-hour increments and can hit every hour, whereas this one, despite having more clicks, it can't cleanly hit all of the hours. So you'll see as you go around, you can't perfectly hit the odd hours, only the even hours. So that was definitely, especially for anybody who's going to be using this as a GMT, that was definitely a big improvement there. While we're on the topic of bezel, you can probably notice, and this is one where we will talk a little bit about the color, the visibility or legibility of the bezel on the V2 is improved over the V1, and that's not just a colorway specific item. There were some font changes, as well as I think the general boldness and clarity of all of the V2 iterations, with the exception of perhaps the ice, which has been reviewed in some other videos, where it's just the colors that make it less legible. It tends to wash out, and the meteorite tends to be a little harder to read as well. But as far as the fundamental of the bezel itself, it is, I believe, a little more clear on the V2. Similarly, another update for the V2, you can see that they're both a day and night type GMT bezel in terms of colorway. However, on this, as we'll see later on with a Lume shot, this particular one with the frost, this is a full Lume dial, but on all of the V2s, they have a lumed bezel, whereas on the V1, only the pip here, so just that little triangle at the top, only the pip is lumed, and this is a BGW9 on this one. This particular version has a half full lume in here, so this entire lower half where it's this white on the bezel is lumed, and then the top is just the numerals, but the full bezel itself is lumed. On some of the other colorways, there are other ones that have the half lume, and there are other ones that have only the numerals that are lume, but in all cases they do have more lume than the V1. Next, moving on to the case. One of the reasons why I wanted to show this on these pillows like this is I think it really helps to accent some of these differences here from the case profile. The V2 as a whole was reduced in overall case height. If you're holding them without being on a flat surface, it's a little harder to perceive the difference in the height. Part of it is due to the case back, where it rides and sits a little bit lower, and you pick that up more when it's sitting on something like these pillows. And you can see it's not a dramatic difference, but the actual watch itself is lower. Now the crystal does protrude higher, so that tends to offset. However, when it comes to wearing, particularly if you're trying to wear with dress attire or under a shirt cuff, this will tend to slide a little easier under a shirt cuff in my experience. Additionally, on the bezel, closing the loop there, if you look on the side, you can see the bezel from a side profile is chopped down. In terms of ease of access, I can still very easily access either of these two models, so I don't find that to be a problem, and it tends to accentuate a little more with this box crystal, seeing it from the edge. Now let's go ahead and pop these off of the case, or off of the pillows here. There is a complete difference in overhaul of the case backs. While this is a relatively minor thing, I did want to point this out just to give a complete deep dive and look here. So if we look at these two case backs, you can see, and we already talked about the overall height to where they're changed in that regard to help make it a little more thin, but the overall finishing of the two is completely different as well. You can see on the right here, it's much more of a traditional with the milled in text. With this, it's more of a stamp. With this, it's all brush, and this is the V1 here on the right. This is all brushed. On the V2, you have a brush around the edge, and then more of a satin or bead blasted type finish here, and then the raised numerals as opposed to the recessed for that. Overall, they're both still the ETA 2893. Overall dimensions, we didn't talk about this earlier on. The case is still the 48 millimeters. The bezel still 38.5 millimeters. So it still fundamentally shares all of the details that are addressed in the V2 in terms of salient specs, with the exception of the items that we're highlighting here. Some of the other little differences, so we talked about the finishing, we talked about the overall case back itself being different. If you notice here on the movements, you can see the V1, both of these have an ETA 2893, but the V1 has that gorgeous decoration there. It has a perlage, and then it has some custom milling that's a little tough to see deeper down in. Whereas the V2, unfortunately, this was a change from ETA. This was not a Zelos change. Both of these are the elaborate grade ETA 2893s, but unfortunately ETA stopped producing with the fancier decorations. They both do still have the custom rotor and otherwise are the same movement. Another small item is the date or the exhibition window here. From my measurements, I'm getting about 1 millimeter difference between these two. This is about 26 millimeter. This is about 25 millimeter. Again, these are minor things, but did just want you guys to all to be aware of the minor differences, because there really were a lot of updates. Closing out the differences in the watch itself, or the purchase itself, is with this is an aftermarket strap on the Aventurine, and I'll have a link in the description if you are interested in purchasing a similar style canvas strap. But one of the things that I wanted to look at is what accessories are included. So both of these will still come with the acacia wood boxes, the leather watch roll, or the leather watch roll, all of those kind of elements. The V1 did not come with a bracelet. So there was an available bracelet that was offered after launch, but that of course is now available readily. The V1 came with a Horween leather strap with quick adjust, and it also came with a Tropic rubber strap. The V2 changed things up, and because of the popularity of the bracelet, came with these nice bracelets with solid end links. You can see it's curved to the case, very well finished, very comfortable, 6 micro adjust holes on the clasp. Overall, just a great bracelet. These came standard on the V2. It also came with the Tropic rubber strap, but they discontinued or did not include the Horween strap. So with both of these, you get two strap options. With the V2, you receive the bracelet as well as the Tropic rubber strap. With the V1, you receive the Tropic rubber strap, so the same strap, and then the Horween leather strap to go along with that. So now let's take a look at the lume of these. As you can see, it's somewhat of an apples and oranges comparison here between these two specific colorways that we have. In the case of the left model here, we are looking at the V2 Frost, and with that you can see this is the full lume, so of course it does have a lot more lume going on. On the right, the V1, despite not having a full lume dial, it does have exceedingly bright markers, which is something that is a signature feature of any Zelos watch that you're going to look at. So certainly, just as with all the other ones, the lume will not disappoint in either, and the same thing is true for the V1 with the various colorway, or I'm sorry, the V2 with the various colorways. That will still have very impressive lume. It will be more similar to the V1 model that you see here. But the main difference is going to be that the V2 will have that full loomed bezel. I hope this video has been helpful, and if you're looking at the V1 versus the V2, my easy summary for this is I really don't think you can go wrong with either. Despite the fact that looking at the similarities of the cases, you can tell that these are models that have a lot of commonality. Really, at the end of the day, these watches have a completely different feel. They have a completely different look and wrist presence. The dial, the rehaut, the chaptering, all of these kind of elements, they come together where when you stop looking at the case, you don't pay too much attention to the bezel detail, and you're really looking at the hallmark of the watches and looking into those dial, they have a completely different feel to them, with this having that rehaut in the indexes, with this one having the more steep rehaut, and all of the aspects that go along with that. It really, they are pretty dramatically different watches. Both of them are excellent. I strongly recommend, if you're considering either of these, I would not hesitate to pick them up. I hope this has been helpful.